Your infrastructure is still there. It still matters. Your application cannot run without infrastructure. But should your developers care? Does anybody outside of the infrastructure team actually care about infrastructure, except when it's DNS that's not working? Join me today, along with John Willis and Guy Currier, on the Tech Field Day podcast. Welcome to the Tech Field Day podcast, where we bring together a group of IT technical experts to discuss a single idea about key concepts in the industry. This podcast features a variety of perspectives from members of the Tech Field Day delegate community and is often recorded in association with one of our events. Tech Field Day is part of the Futurum Group, and this podcast is also published on our sister company site, TechStrong TV. On this episode, as we're looking towards KubeCon, we'll be discussing how well-managed Kubernetes means infrastructure finally doesn't matter. But before the discussion, let's meet who's on today's panel. Joining me again is Guy Currier.
Yeah, good to be here. Hi, Alastair. I am one of the analysts at the Futurum Group, and I think infrastructure doesn't matter.
And of course, John Willis also joins us for your first time on the Tech Field Day podcast.
Yes, great. Thanks for having me. Like always, we joked when you first invited me to Field Day. I felt like I got my picture on the cover of the Rolling Stone. Finally, all these years. As the sort of the resident DevOps, I would say like I was born in infrastructure. I&O has been my game. I think it does matter, and so let's have some fun.
And of course, I'm Alastair Cooke. I'm the event lead here at Tech Field Day, and we'll be having a great time at KubeCon. Of course, my background also was all in infrastructure. I was a VMware guy, and before that, I was a Microsoft, and even going back long enough that I had long curly hair, I was a Novell NetWare specialist at the early stages of my career. So the idea that infrastructure doesn't matter is an interesting concept to have. Infrastructure to me has always mattered. The plumbing has always been important, yet the plumbing isn't the thing that makes the business work. The plumbing is a necessary evil in order to get something in front of business and applications that help whatever business is paying for that infrastructure to do a better job of shipping widgets or satisfying customers in whatever way, increasing shareholder value, I guess. The infrastructure doesn't really do that directly. It's the necessary thing in order to get to the applications.
Yeah, I'm going to have to jump right in because, boy, this reminds me so much of the early days of cloud. In the early days of cloud, everybody tried to convince everybody that plumbing didn't matter. And it became, and it was like, the differentiation was, you don't need rack and stack people anymore. And you just need to, so the infrastructure all goes away because of the cloud. And we knew that was all baloney. And what was what became one of the most important jobs in the cloud era? It was infrastructure people. It was SRE. It was the highest paid people. I mean, it's why they had Google wear bombardier jackets, on campus to let you know these are the people to keep the light on. It's why SRE is a core piece of every sort of enterprise today. So, we can go deeper into this, but again, deja vu. We think agents now are going to be very much like the pixie dust cloud days, where the cloud was really just the business needs infrastructure. It doesn't resonate on the P&Ls directly, but without it, think about the cloud titans. Convince them that the plumbing, plus Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, that the plumbing doesn't matter.
Well, anybody who's followed me knows that I'm making a joke when I say that I think infrastructure doesn't matter. But maybe infrastructure doesn't matter. So let me explain. First of all, that's one word, but we generally mean something a little bit deeper than it doesn't matter. Because obviously, right, you need infrastructure. And actually, I would violently disagree with you, Alastair, over the idea that the infrastructure doesn't do anything. It's the plumbing. And I know you didn't mean that literally, but I still violently disagree with you anyway, because infrastructure decisions have an enormous impact on, for example, geography. Where is this service or application going to be available? which has a profound. I mean, you can literally change nothing whatsoever about an application and just extend its domain into a new geography. That, in my opinion, has done something. But let's say that infrastructure doesn't matter because nobody cares about application performance anymore. Nobody cares about reliability, availability, consistency. They only care about what they can sell or what they can get across or what they can convince people to cough up money or time or both for. And just like in the early days of cellular phone service, people didn't seem to care about drop calls and all that other kind of stuff that the phone companies got, all excited about, saying, "Well, you never picked up and didn't get a dial tone right, so you should have the same level of service from cellular." It turned out nobody cared about that level of service. So, kind of levels of service and capability of an app. I mean, how many times have you had trouble using an app? Many, many, many times. So I just kind of feel like the community as a whole, the application management development community as a whole, are just like, eh. And for that reason, infrastructure doesn't matter.
But I mean, should an application developer need to care about the details of the infrastructure? Should that be the responsibility of the application developers?
I think no. I mean, that's why, I was saying earlier, I think as we get into more automation, we can use the word agentic, or we can just say automation, or we can say AI, whatever we want to call it. Things are going to get easier and more powerful for the developer, the application developer. But I think, I use this sort of idea that, in the land of the blind, there's sort of the one-eyed person is the king. And I think the thing that will keep us grounded will always be infrastructure. So I think there's this sort of interesting sort of play on the way we're using this. Does it matter to the application developer? It shouldn't. It never should have, right? But we never really made that demarcation properly enough to protect it. And, but I think now more than ever, as we rely on sort of agents, and I'm just going to call it automation from here on in, but as we rely on sort of advanced AI automation, the complexities of the things that can go wrong. And there's tons of evidence now over this year of rogue agents, polymorphic AI. I mean, just insane stuff going on, that it is more important than ever not to neglect info. But the goal has always been, can we make an application developer so that they don't have to worry about this? And again, I think we've failed miserably, and I'm not sure that we've ever figured out how to make advanced automated technology, including
Well,
DevOps.
Kubernetes is supposed to do that
Yeah,
to a
but
certain
how?
degree, at least significantly do that. And that's the
Well,
premise here.
we're looking at 15
Kubernetes.
years, and it hasn't, right? I mean, when Kubernetes announced, like 2011, I mean, we're literally getting to a 15-year anniversary, and still to this day, if you look at like the vulnerabilities and the CVEs and everything, in fact, I don't know if you guys had tracked earlier this year, or maybe it was late last year, the Hugging Space example, where they took an inference model, an embedding model, and they were able to literally not only break out an inference to break out of a model to get access to a Kubernetes cluster on Hugging Face, that broke out of the Kubernetes cluster and literally were running on a shared customer host. Right. So when we talk about all this automation and AI, this was literally just a query against an embedding model that literally was able to break out to a shared customer host. So the complexities are it's a way more complex than it's ever been. And again, I would contend that we haven't really done a great job.
I think that the premise that we're working on here treats this as if it's binary, as if infrastructure suddenly doesn't matter, as if that switch turns off. But I think what we're actually finding in the real world is that it's not. It's a degree. So I can recall early in my career, I would get a server and I would be putting an additional CPU in it and some RAM DIMMs and putting parallel SCSI drives and being that old. That kind of work, and similarly as John's talked about, the rack and stack of putting servers into racks, that has ceased to be nearly as important, it's become much less of a vital job than it was 30, 40 years ago. what we're seeing is a shift in what we expect from that infrastructure. So in the same way that we no longer get concerned about dropped calls on our mobile phones, because we very seldom get dropped calls. Now we're concerned about something else going on, spam callers on our mobile phones. And so what we care about in the infrastructure is shifting rather than the infrastructure itself going away. But I think, John, you're absolutely right. The degree of complexity that's now in that infrastructure, the more and more layers of complexity mean that there is absolutely something that needs to be managed, something that's vital to be looked after. But we do keep hiding more and more layers underneath. We really want more layers of abstraction, and that's how we can build to these massive scales. We certainly couldn't be building enterprise data centers as they are today by putting together servers onesie twosie and manually cabling every change. So I think we are seeing that shift. Whether Kubernetes is the magic pixie dust that is hiding yet another layer away, yeah, it's definitely hiding a layer away. Absolutely. I would much rather be using declarative tools to deploy infrastructure to a Kubernetes cluster than doing imperative commands to turn up even just containers on hosts, let alone workloads and VMs.
Let's focus on that declaration or that set of declarations. That is, let's say, produced by the infrastructure manager or the platform management, right? It is designed to support the application or applications. It doesn't have to be static. It can be somewhat dynamic, refreshed, like that sort of thing. Granted, I think John hit on the nub of the question, which is, does the development team, does the application management team need to write those requirements, need to create those declarations, need to be involved in those declarations? And so if you're looking at it from that standpoint, I mean, this is, KubeCon week, and we're talking about cloud native, and we're talking about Kubernetes, and what we are talking about it, relatively speaking, from the standpoint of the platform engineers who want developers and application people deploying applications to do whatever they want to do and not have to worry about all of that stuff. But I don't think we've gotten actually, John, all that far from the old days of developers having to worry about using the correct libraries, hooks, or compilers in order to avoid things like Stack Overflow. I do think it's at a higher level, but you write the application, and if it stalls or is unable to use a service, or there's lots of sources and reasons for that now, that might come down to how much memory or even how much level 3 cache there is available to the application. That's where it does matter for the person writing the application. Why does it matter to the person developing the application? Because they use different libraries or a different AI prompt or a coder or a different type of flow in the code in order to address or avoid that infrastructure area. And that's where it does matter. All of a sudden, it's changing how I'm building the application. I don't think that has changed, especially. It's higher level.
To keep it more simple, right? Like you really need, I'm biased, right? I'm an infrastructure, like Alastair, like my whole life has been operations and infrastructure. I was the ops part of DevOps when that thing started, right? I think I think that my idea about there's a great opportunity. I think this idea of infrastructure architects are going to be more important than ever. And you're still going to need platform architects, to your point, right? I want the platform architects to make sure that the developers don't have to worry and are be given the best decision-making opportunities for what abstraction layers to use, right? But I want the infrastructure architects to be able to have their back. Again, plumbing doesn't matter until you can't get the water. Right. And then it matters. And let's take, for example, the cliche of what's the cliche of infrastructure conversation of the last couple of weeks? It's DNS, right? And so does DNS matter to an application developer? The answer should be absolutely not. Right? No, it shouldn't matter to anybody who uses the internet until it doesn't work. And, Adrian Kokroff had an article he just put out yesterday where his suggestion was like, here's probably the things, if you were using Amazon, you should have done. And you could have, like, he is a really thoughtful, and, Adrian was the guy who brought Cloud 2 in most part, to Netflix. And, and it was a well thought out, like, hey, have you thought about, if you really want redundancy? And that, again, that would be the role of an infrastructure architect, to help them make those kind of decisions. Not to go too deep into the tech problem of what happened in Amazon, but there were other people that wrote articles like, here's why we, for tier 1 applications, do not use DynamoDB, right? Because it's not protected as a tier 1 service, right? And so again, I think, in a world where this thing gets fleshed out, especially in AI, and you have now these rogue complexities, I think there's going to be a world for these 3 types of roles. But hopefully, if architected right, and let me say one last thing, Kubernetes, I still question whether Kubernetes is the right decision. And I think AI might actually give us the chance to figure that out. But today it is the lingua franca, right? Of like, you got to have platforms. That's a no-brainer. There's been some good competitive tries against Kubernetes that just all went away. So Kubernetes is the answer today. So as I'm sounding terribly hateful against Kubernetes, I'm not. I think the world is what you're saying, Guy. We need application developers to be shielded so they can work on the application and services and the business and the communication between the business. We need the platform people to be able to give them the best decision-making. Like, don't use DynamoDB if it's tier 0 customer-facing application. In other words, if it can never, ever, ever go down, don't use this. Here's some other services we've designed for that. And I need the infrastructure architects to be able to have their back of like how to give them the right tooling and frameworks and architecture so that the platform people can give the best abstraction opportunities to the developers.
Well, I think that Kubernetes is an absurdly capable overall platform ecosystem. Use the word you like. That is only it's kind of only begun to fight. It's got a lot more development to go, and it does create the window for a much simpler infrastructure approach from the developer and from the application manager, namely a more declarative or guidance-based approach rather than having to get into any of the weeds and figure any of that stuff out, or even do what they hate to do the most, which is talk to IT ops and plan with IT ops, because that's just friction in the gears for them. So I do think that so for example, there are code inspection tools right now. The StackGen is one of the recent examples that I've looked at that can help create the happy home for an application just by looking at the code. And I don't want to overstate those capabilities, but that is a new tool set so that the coders can just code, and then the infrastructure folks use something like a StackGen, and whippity-doo-dah, they have their Terraform WAML ready to go. I almost said WASM because my mind's on WASM. So that is an example of conceptually where the developer doesn't have to matter and then infrastructure doesn't matter. But I don't agree with that ultimately because I still think the developers need to say what their intent is, how they expect the thing to behave, and where it's supposed to behave, and how it's supposed to operate under stress. And that is necessary information about the infrastructure.
Well, and just so the one problem, and I agree, right? Again, that this is why I go back to, I don't know if Kubernetes really is the right answer when it's all said and done, because right now, any of those things have inference bias. So literally, if I'm looking, if an inference, sort of an agent or sort of an LLM based inference is trying to decide what is the best way to deliver this application, there's tons of bias there, right? Because and so what we're missing is the opportunity for like, are there better ways to do infrastructure? And again, the only reason I'm pointing that out is this is why I think infrastructure architects are incredibly important, because it'll be their role to decide for the business what is the right plumbing? And it may or may not be Kubernetes in this new world.
Yeah, I think sort of the definition of the right infrastructure for your application, or a standardized infrastructure, so your developer doesn't need to care, is an interesting challenge. StackGen is relatively new. AWS Elastic Beanstalk has been around for a long time, and that starts with just give me your source code and tell me a little bit of detail of what you want around it. Yet even Elastic Beanstalk, now you can drill down into all of the details of the virtual machine configuration that you want to use with this, and how you want the load balancer to behave. And these are all infrastructure elements. These are, even though you're supposed to be just starting with application source code and somebody will make the decisions for you, that's just not the way it works. I think the dream state of an AI will scan your source code and say, this is the infrastructure it needs. And then somewhere in there, in your source code, you'll have a manifest of business rules of this is the amount of availability, this is our tolerance to cost. Yeah, that's still a long way away. And Kubernetes is not necessarily the tool that's going to do that for us. It may well be that invisible underlying infrastructure will be Kubernetes beneath. There's some definite benefits to using it. But I'm always somewhat concerned about an infrastructure tool where the canonical source of this is how you build it is entitled Kubernetes the hard way by Kelsey Hightower. Still remains sort of a reflection on the fact that Kubernetes maybe isn't the best infrastructure for all situations. And obviously there isn't going to be a single infrastructure that is best for every place. So infrastructure does then continue to matter, and well-managed Kubernetes is giving us one type of infrastructure we might want, but it's not taking away the need to care about that infrastructure.
It's a hammer nail problem, right? I mean, literally. I mean, it really is, right? And it may be the best we got, but it may not be.
Yeah, I think that what I'm seeing right now is the next stage beyond Elastic Beanstalk, because it is more dynamic and it's frankly agentic. And that is this AI ops concept. But I think you make a really good point, John, that I didn't mean to imply the contrary to, which is just like every freaking AI everywhere and possibly forever, collaboration with and workflows that rely on human expert involvement and supervision is a critical point to it. The role of containers and Kubernetes in particular in this does seem to offer promise to simplify things so that developers don't need to know ops and ops don't need to know code, or application code. It does seem to do that, but that's the more technical side of the other side of the fence, if we're taking those two sides. And it would be welcome for that engagement to be more strategic, more guidance based, and less technical, so that no one has to say, I need this, and this specifically that's in your job description.
Right. I mean, again, I love to sort of like look at these things through a historical lens, right? And for those who probably don't know, I sold a company to Docker when there was only like 40 people there, and it was the first sort of a SDN implementation of networking for Docker, right? A company called Socket Plane. And so I was I was sort of involved in the containers from a development side and software side right from the get-go. And one of the things that containers did, which was that truly was the first time in my whole career, and I've been doing this 45 years now, that where I saw developers had entree to infrastructure almost all the way through the process. And that was the original promise. I could develop code in an infrastructure container on my laptop that is going to be a 98% similar, never 100%, when it's running in production. And that world was going towards complete developer authority, and then what came along? Kubernetes. And all of a sudden, who owned Kubernetes became this question. I don't think that's ever really been answered. I mean, we call it product, we call it platform engineering, but then we have a complete debate about what that really means, right? But like when Kubernetes came out, it was like, okay, I mean, the world for developers and containers were like, hey, ops, kind of get out of the way. I know what this thing's going to look like. All you have to do is worry about any sort of escape velocity of what happens to a container when it's running in a production environment. And the I'm not trying to make it binarily simple, but it was simpler because it was either something that was an application that was related to the container, or it was something outside of the container, and the sort of the processes that manage the container. But then all of a sudden you added this Kubernetes, which seemed glorious. And the truth is, you go on, I know we're going to run out of time, but what people don't realize is Kubernetes was originally designed as a solution for a Google architecture. I mean, it was literally called the Borg, then it was called Omega, and then it was open sourced as Kubernetes. And why? Because they had invented something called SRE. And basically, the idea of SRE was you could completely 100% separate your developers from your operations infrastructure. And Mark Burgess wrote the forward to the original SRE book, and he talked about this, right? And so if you weren't Google, which basically nobody has been, then in a lot of ways, Kubernetes didn't make sense.
Now, on that great thought, John, I'm going to cut you off because we are running out of time, and I know we can spend hours talking this history and the implementation. But of course, we need to close out this podcast, and we need to give you a reason to connect with John and Guy in the future time. So thank you very much for joining us on the Tech Field Day podcast today. But before we do go, where can people connect and carry the conversation? So, John, where can people connect with you?
Yeah, probably the best place is LinkedIn. It's where I live mostly. I think John Willis Atlanta, because there were 3 other John Willises, and none of them lived in Atlanta. So John Willis Atlanta on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to communicate with me.
LinkedIn's a good place for me too. I'm sure there are plenty more Guy Curriers, but I'm linkedin.com/in/Guy Currier. So that's pretty easy. Blue Sky is another good place for me. GuyCurrier.bsky.app or .social. Sorry, bsky.social.
Excellent. And of course, I'm Alastair Cooke. You can find me also on LinkedIn. I think I am the only Alastair Cooke with this moustache, certainly the only one that wears this moustache today. And you can find me across various of the Futurum sites where you'll also find Guy to be found. You'll find all 3 of us at KubeCon in Atlanta as well. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast. And if you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast application. And make sure you don't miss a single episode. We bring them out to you every week. Do consider giving us a review and a rating just to help other people find us. This podcast was brought to you by Tech Field Day, the home of IT experts from across the enterprise and a part of the Futurum Group. For upcoming events and more episodes, head to techfieldday.com/podcast or view us on Textron TV. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.